The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
Hello and welcome again to another program of What Catholics Believe. This is part of the series of catechetical instructions I'm giving on the basis of the book, A Brief Catechism for Adults. Now, the third lesson has to do with God and the Blessed Trinity. And I've actually already done two sections of, two programs, I should say, on this lesson. Tonight will be a third. And I'm adding these latter two lessons to the initial program covering the third lesson, realizing that many people do not have any intention of going any deeper, and I appreciate that, I understand that. This is not a scholarly presentation by any means, but it is a little deeper treatment of the question of God's existence in light of modern-day atheism. And for those who have no interest in going any deeper into the question, well, they can certainly pass over these last two programs on the third lesson in the Catechism. But there are those who certainly have an interest, especially because they might know someone at work or among their friends or even in their family who has espoused atheism. And perhaps it would be good for them to here are some of the things mentioned during these latter two programs on this third lesson from A Brief Catechism for Adults. Now, I intend to be somewhat brief. I hope to be briefer in this program than I was in the last one. I want to just clarify a number of things, and I want to address the points that St. Thomas Aquinas makes. I did talk about atheism and atheists in the last program, but I didn't actually address the two objections that St. Thomas Aquinas made to the existence of God, at least the current objections, the objections current in his day and still current in our day. When St. Thomas raised the question, "On Deus sit," that is, whether God would exist, whether God exists, he said there were two basic objections that would be raised against the existence of God. And one objection would be that the world accounts for itself. It does not need a creator, and it is perfectly self-sufficient unto itself. The second the second objection that St. Thomas raised was that in the world there is evil. And because of the existence of evil, that proves that it is not the creation of a good, all-wise, all-knowing, all-loving God. Now, to address this question, the first question about the cosmos, the cosmos, or the world, the universe accounting for itself, perhaps it would be instructive to refer back to an article by a man named Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was an atheist, a scientist. He wrote he wrote science fiction works. He also wrote actually books of prurient poems, as it turns out. But he had a rather long article in one of the major it wasn't so much a tabloid, it was one of these weekly news magazines that came with the New York Times years ago. And the article was entitled, I forget the title of the article, I beg your pardon. But the point of the article was that those who believe in God represent the forces of darkness, and they must be defeated. Belief in God must be rejected, and those who believe in Him must be defeated because they are leading the world down the primrose path into darkness. And during this article, Isaac Asimov actually addressed an argument made by those who are theists, by those who believe in God. He said that those who believe in God argue that the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy as it's called, is an argument in favor of the existence of God. And he explained this second law of thermodynamics very briefly. He said that it says that the disorder in any system tends to increase. Randomness tends to increase. So there's always a tendency in any system to disintegrate, so to speak, and to go from order to disorder. Wherever there is order, it always tends by force of nature, by law of nature, to tend to disorder. And we see that all around us. We know how difficult it is to maintain order. And we see the things that we make disintegrate. We see them come apart. We see them stop working. We see things decaying and things rusting. And these are all minor examples of the general law, the second law of thermodynamics, that order tends to decrease and disorder tends to increase. Randomness tends to increase in the world. Now, the theists, those who believe in God, say, but there is tremendous order in the world that we know here on earth. There's tremendous order here. There is order not only within species of beings, there is order even among them. There is, even in a blade of grass, we see tremendous order and structure. That's what an organism is. An organism is a living structure. It is a complex being. Any complexity of structure indicates order. We see it all around us. We are part of that order. And so life especially has to be highly organized and highly ordered. I was sitting next to a gentleman who looked like a latter-day H.G. Wells on an airplane one day. In fact, even his dress might have come out of early 20th century England. And we got to talking, and this gentleman told me, I think he was maybe a few years younger than I at the time, he told me he was an atheist. And we got to talking about atheism, and I just mentioned to him the idea of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, structure, order, and so on. And because he seemed to have a little bit of a scientific mind to him. And he actually had a banana that he had gotten from the flight attendant that was handing out snacks. And we were talking about the marvel that there we are at 33,000 feet. The outside air temperature was about 60 below zero Fahrenheit. And we were basically in a flying building of our own construction, of our own design. And that this should be considered to be very remarkable, and certainly an indication of something not supernatural, but that in itself was supernatural, because it is natural to us to do such things. But the fact that it is natural to us to do such things, as to design flying buildings and fly in them around the world, that should be considered to be such an enormous manifestation. It's a great manifestation of the fact that there's something in us that reflects the intelligence of God, that he can't just dismiss the existence of God with just a wave of the hand as though there were no arguments in favor of it. And I mentioned that as complex as this airplane was that we were flying in, with all of its wires and all of its electronic components and its communication abilities with points on the ground and so on, all of that, I said, is nothing in comparison with the organization within the banana that he was eating, even at that very time. That the organization and structure and order in that banana was far, far more complex than the order and the organization in the airplane in which we were flying. And that was the work of nature, and the work of nature's God. And I don't know that he saw the point or got the point or even was willing to admit the point if he got it. But the point is, we see order as an indication of something that does not come from nature, but comes from God who created nature. Now, Isaac Asimov's answer to that was, and his entire answer to that whole point made by those who believe in God, that nature goes the other way. Nature actually defies itself, you might say, in the fact that there is such great order and organization of organisms here on Earth. Isaac Asimov dismissed all of that by saying that all of that is the result of the power of the sun. The existence of the sun, by its power, has driven nature in the opposite direction from its natural tendency, you might say, and has artificially, quote unquote, I made up the term there, he didn't apply it, has somehow, by way of anomaly, driven this planet in the direction of order, greater and greater complexity, higher and higher organization, order, and that this will all be reversed when the sun flames out and all of it begins to disappear and lapse back into disorder and randomness again, as all of this organization dies out. Well, again, this is an illustration of the problem of modern thinking, that they take it one step and they drop it, and they can't think beyond that, it seems. And St. Thomas, again, in raising his point for this infinite series of contingent causes, points out that, yes, but you can have the sun, that's true, and the energy from the sun, which cannot explain the organization here on Earth and the existence of life here on the Earth. That's something that Isaac Asimov just reached for, looking for some plausible explanation, at least plausible to him or some people. So there's no way to explain the order here on Earth in complex organisms simply by pumping the energy of the sun into the Earth. But even if one could reach for that and plausibly use that as an argument, the question would be that, well, where does the sun come from? The sun also comes and goes, okay? It depends upon other things happening for its existence, which depends upon other things happening for their existence, which depend upon other things happening for their existence. None of these are necessary being. And the point is that it is absurd in our minds to deposit an endless series into the past, an endless series of contingent beings that all depend upon each other going back infinitely. It reminds me, I guess, offhand of the cartoon character who is climbing up the rope. He climbs and climbs and climbs and gets to the top of the rope and it's not tied to anything. Or the person who is climbing down the pile of boxes of the beanstalk and gets to the bottom and it's not rooted in anything. There's nothing there. There has to be some foundation for a series of contingent causes, and the only foundation for that can be a necessary cause which exists of itself and doesn't need to be created or derived from any other cause. It has no cause which makes it be. It simply is. To the human mind, to posit such an infinite series, an endless series of dependent causes, all depending upon each other, is absurd. And again, Isaac Asimov just reaches for this, what to us is the indication of an argument from ad absurdum, by saying that the organization, the order on the earth here, derives from the energy of the sun, and that's the end of the question. Nothing more to it. Does that answer the question? The fact is, those who would wish to do away with God must explain existence itself, the fact that anything exists. It's very obvious that things exist. Descartes had to prove to himself his own existence by saying, I think, therefore I am. And so he convinced himself of his own existence, or made an argument for his own existence to himself. But the fact is that the fact that anything exists, it must derive its existence from something else. And the fact that the only things we know exist that we experience are contingent beings certainly is the indication. And all the things that we can blame those contingent beings on, that we can attribute them to, are contingent. Again, they come and they go, they depend. They don't exist of themselves. They don't exist out of necessity. But they derive their existence from something else. And again, it would be a reductio ad absurdum to say that this just goes on forever. There's no foundation for any of these things which actually have their existence. Rather than accept the absurdity, we see rationally that there is a foundation in a necessary being whom we know as God. But let's move on to the existence of evil. Here's another question. This is the question that plagued St. Augustine for many years of his life. St. Augustine was trying to account for evil in this world. You know, his mother was a Christian, a Catholic, St. Monica, and his father had been a pagan. And Augustine lived the pagan life, even though he had been baptized. And his mother was trying by her prayers to retrieve him back to faith. And just when she thought perhaps that she'd lost him and he escaped from northern Africa to Italy, there, or what is now Italy, there he encountered St. Ambrose in Milan. And St. Ambrose, by the force of his argument, won over St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a rhetorician, as you know. He was skilled in logical argumentation, expressing his thoughts and understanding and analyzing the thoughts of others in a clear, elegant way. And he was so impressed by St. Ambrose, he listened to him, and his mind, his intellect was actually vanquished. He was convinced by St. Ambrose. Even then, St. Augustine hesitated to become a Christian, to become Catholic, because he feared that with his past life he would not be able to live up to the Catholic faith and he might be a disgrace to it. So he hesitated to join, and yet he did, by the grace of God, embrace the faith, become a member of the church, accept baptism. Or rather, he actually didn't have to accept it. He had already been baptized, and he became not only a very good Catholic gentleman, but he became a Catholic priest, a Catholic bishop, and the greatest of the doctors of the church, the fathers of the church, in the Latin Rite, the Latin world. Now, St. Augustine, during his troubled years, was desperately trying to explain to himself, to account for the existence of evil. He even fell into the error of Gnosticism, under the form of Manichaeism at one time, the false belief that there were two gods, one good, one evil. And the evil God had overcome the good God and imprisoned him in the world, and there was this great struggle going on between the good God and the evil God for control, and thus the great struggle between good and evil in the world. But St. Augustine, by the grace of God, came to understand what evil is. And we as Catholics, as true Christians, we understand what evil really is. Evil is not something that exists of itself. It is something that is an abscess or an absence. It is like what is missing in the world, and that is an absence of the good that should be there. Evil is actually the absence of a good that is due to something that should be there. We don't call it there are two kinds of evil. There's a physical evil and there's a moral evil. Okay, physical evil is the evil that happens in the world. I guess we would call forest fires that burn down homes and even kill people, earthquakes, floods, the things that we endure that attack us and hurt us, we consider to be evils. But these are physical evils. Diseases and hunger also. Accidents that injure us or maim us or even kill us, we consider physical evils. They are not attacks done to us by some thinking beings that are out to get us and hurt us. These are just the physical things that happen in the world with which we live. And those are different, very different from the moral evils. Moral evil is what is perpetrated knowingly, willfully by a human being in the world. The things we do that are evil. The things that we will that are evil. And physical evils that usually involve guilt. But moral evil does, because it involves our intelligence, our will, our consciousness, actually choosing evil. They involve going against the moral law of God, whereas physical evils are according to the natural laws of the world in which we live. Now, St. Augustine was actually, in a way, trying to account for both types of evil in the world. The atheist looks at the world and sees the evils in the world, probably for the most part the evil things that happen in the world, diseases and so on. They say, well, if there were a good God who created this world, he wouldn't have these evil things. But then the atheist goes on beyond that and says, well, look, I mean, if a good God created us, he would not have created us this way because we do evil things. We do evil things to each other. They look at Hitler, they look at Stalin, and they look at the great monsters of history, and they say, look at the terrible evil that is there. How can you claim there is a good God who not only created this world, but actually sustains it and if allows this or even enables it by sustaining it in existence when there is such evil and such suffering in the world. An atheist existentialist named Albert Camus is reported to have witnessed an automobile accident in Algiers when he was there. He saw a car strike a little boy. And when he finally arrived upon the scene, when he ran over there, by that time the mother had gathered up the little boy in her arms and was holding him, and he was dead. And she was wailing for her grief. And after moments of witnessing this, Camus shouted to all of those gathered around, indignantly, "You see, heaven is silent." And that was his statement. A kind of an indictment of God, if he believed in God, which he did not, he said at the time, would do nothing to protect this woman and her child and allay her grief. Did he really not believe in God, or was he just angry? Well, so many atheists do come across as though they just don't like what's happening. They don't like the world. And so they have the idea that almost to spite God, they will deny he exists. Or they will say, well, if there is a God, as Richard Dawkins said to Francis Collins, he can't be the Christian God because he's just not nice enough. He's too mean. In any case, but for us who are Catholics, we understand what evil is. Evil is an abscess. One might still say, well, then how could God create the good God, the true God, whom we know? How could he create a world in which there could be an abscess in the human soul, and which could give rise to so much evil, deliberate, conscious, willful evil on our part? Well, as far as the physical evils in the world, we can account for those by appealing to the moral evil and the origin of moral evil. We say that God created this world in its perfection, just the way it should be, in its natural perfection. He created us in our natural perfection, and then he even gave us the supernatural perfection of sanctifying grace. And with that sanctifying grace, he also gave us the preternatural gifts, impassibility, immortality, infused knowledge. And God gave us all of this good. And we were created not defective, not at all, but because we are not God, God created finite creatures. He did not create us gods. We were not defective, but we were defectible. That is, we were capable of swerving or turning from the path and from the good. Any creature is going to be defectible. It is not God. By definition, it is not God. Cannot be God. It has its limitations. And so God, having given us intellect and free will, creating us in his own image, to know what is true and love what is good and enjoy what is beautiful. And in his own likeness, by the power of sanctifying grace, God gave us these goods. But we, by the use of our free will, had the power to turn away from these things. And this is what happened, we say, at the dawn of creation, with the first temptation here on earth. When the temptation came to be your own God, which was the temptation that fell to Eve. You determine good and evil. You eat, you deny, you defy God, and you will declare your own divinity, basically. You are your own God. Now Eve was told, you will become God, knowing good and evil. No, they had never known evil. You know how curious we are about evil? Well, Adam and Eve, as God made them, had never known evil. And so this represented a very serious temptation to Eve. It was the same temptation that the great angel Lucifer fell to. The temptation to declare independence, so enamored of his own powers that he declared, I will be my own God. And so it was with Eve, declaring independence from God, rebelled, and Adam also. With that, we know that moral evil entered the human soul, and physical evil entered the world. The order that God created in the world was very much a reflection of the order that God was making for man, and the order that man himself, human beings, were going to have in the world. And when the chief manifestation of that order, the chief embodiment of that order in human nature rebelled against God, all of nature reflected that rebellion had been against us. It's not that all of nature rebelled against God, because it wouldn't have the intellect and the will to deliberately do so, to defy God. The point is that we, being in rebellion against God, suffer because the world will no longer be at our service entirely. And so we live in a world in which we have brought disorder. The disorder of what we know as physical evils because of the disorder in the human soul of moral evil. What was that moral evil but the absence of what should have been there? There were certain perfections that were given into the souls of Adam and Eve, our first parents. And those perfections were destroyed by a willful act of both Adam and Eve. And that disorder entered. In fact, even though St. Thomas brings up the existence of evil in the world as an argument against the existence of God, in a sense, the existence of moral evil in the human heart is a powerful argument for the existence of God. Because just as we see that we are unique in all the creatures of the world, we are unique in the way we know things, the way we understand things, the way we do things, even the application of our powers and what we can do with them. We are altogether unique. So we are unique in the evil that we do. Among all the created beings, among all the forms of life on earth, There is in us an evil which is an absolute malice. We don't see that kind of malice in any other living things. We don't see in other living things the kind of evil that human beings have in their hearts. The evil that would want to destroy, that would want to torment and torture one of our own fellow human beings, that delights in seeing the agony and torment of another. Think about the malice that is in the hearts and the souls of mankind and what they have done to each other. And how inhumane and how inhuman they've been to each other. When a human being becomes really, really corrupted, he doesn't become an animal. He becomes a devil. And we see something altogether unique in the good that human beings do, and the self-sacrifice, the supernatural good that they can do. Not only for each other, but even their care for other forms of life, their care for them. But we see something unique in the malice of a perverted and corrupted soul, a corrupted mind, in terms of the evil that it does. That, too, is an indication that there's something altogether unique about us, that puts us aside or apart from all the other forms of life and existence. And that is because we have souls, we have intelligence, we have will, and that is why when we're good, we're like the angels, and when we're bad, we're like the devils. But we cannot simply be mere animals. We cannot think like mere animals that don't have souls. We necessarily, naturally think as spiritual beings with souls, for good or for ill. Now, if I may digress just for a minute from these 2 points of St. Thomas, I'd like to address a couple of points that have been made in recent times by those who are arguing for the existence of God. There's an argument that is made from probability. For example, someone might calculate that we take the probabilities of having the world exist as it is right now, with all of the random things that had to come together to make this world exist. They say, well, this would have a probability of 1 in times 10 to the 40th power, or something like that, which is incredibly small probability that the world can come into existence just by random events, just by random chance, if I could say it that way. And so it's clear what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is say, look, you scientifically and mathematically minded people, be reasonable. In practice, you accept things as true that you cannot necessarily prove, but you know they are highly probable, and the opposite is highly improbable. And in daily life, in normal life, you accept these things even without proof, just because you consider them to be highly probable, and the opposite to be highly improbable. So why don't you accept the fact that the world simply happening and coming about by accident, without God creating it, is so unlikely that the probability is so infinitesimally small that it's practically impossible. And just accept the fact of God as being by far the most probable explanation for the existence of the world as it is now. Well, I think that argument lacks a certain something, and I don't really appeal to that argument myself. Why? Because someone who is scientifically minded, mathematically minded, says, well, you're admitting that there is a possibility of this world coming to existence by random chance, even though it's very, very small, so small as to be negligible, but nonetheless, in mathematics, in science, there's a possibility that it could have happened, and in fact, the world did happen. So we'll accept that, that, well, there are unlikely things that do happen. And furthermore, there are scientists and philosophers of science who are willing to accept that argument and say, well, fine. There's a scientist named Rice, I think his name is R-H-Y-S, I believe. Anyway, he's the author of a book, Just Six Numbers, and he was saying that the universe, the forces in the universe have to be just so, or the universe could never come into existence. And then later on, and I think I mentioned this to you before, he said, but don't think that this posits the existence of a God who designed the world and made it so. Because rather, as scientists, we have to postulate that there are an infinite number of universes, an infinite number of universes. And if you had an infinite number of universes, with all possible combinations of these forces, then inevitably one of them would have to be exactly like this universe. And therefore we can explain the universe by just positing an infinite number of universes so that this universe becomes one, which is, well, it has to be. One of them has to be like this. Now, ignore the absurdity of what the argument there, because he just said that the only way you could have such a universe is if the numbers are exactly this way. And so how can you then posit an infinite number of universes, which you just admitted could not have existed, and could not exist, and could never have come into being? Although I'm sure he has an answer for that. Regardless, you see to what extent they go to avoid facing the existence of God, even to the point of absurdly positing an infinite number of universes, just pulling the universes out of the hat, just literally pulling them out of the Mad Hatter's hat, I guess, just pulling them out of the hat, and positing them because they need to avoid the conclusion that this universe was created by an intelligent, loving God. This is the extent they'll go to. At one point, you must ask yourself, does it pass the line from goodwill to being just avoidance of the truth? But in any case, the fact is that arguing probabilities, I think, can be problematic, because there may be those who come along, and may well come along and say, well, look, okay, you are taking it from your mathematical calculating there the wrong way. Let's apply the calculations of probability to the actual universe as it is, and they may say, well, when you have this stage of development, you only have certain limited possibilities from here on in. So as you progress in the development of the world to where it is right now, at each stage you have limited possibilities. You don't have an infinite number of possibilities, or even 1 times 10 to the 20 possibilities. Each step of the way, the possibilities become limited as to what the next step can possibly be. So you might have actually reduced the probability of the world coming into existence by accident to a much smaller number, to the point where it gets within range of thinking, well, okay, if we can reduce it to maybe 1 times 10 to the 3rd power, well, that falls within the range of our working mind here. We can work with numbers like that, and we can see, okay, it could happen then. So we have to be a little careful about this. The point is that it's not a matter of probabilities, because the world as it exists right now could not have come into existence by purely random developments. It could not have come into existence by mere mindless chance. The world in which we live had to be created by an intelligent, loving God. And even if one doesn't see that from the chemistry and physics around us, one can definitely tell that from what happens in the human mind and what that reflects, the existence of a spiritual soul. So I would recommend avoiding the probability argument. I think only people who believe in God would be impressed by that. But There's also an argument today in favor of God from the near-death experiences. And you have books written by those who say, as they were dying, they went through this experience, they saw our Lord, they went through the tunnel of light, they saw the light, and they felt the euphoria and all that. But I don't think we should allow our... I mean, we can claim that there are indications here. But the problem is, you see, we can't base our belief in God on these things necessarily, because one can argue them away. And physiologists and those who study the brain are trying very hard to show that these are natural brain experiences, that these are fantasies that the brain engages in extremis when the person is under severe stress and even in danger of death, or even in the process of dying. That there's something natural, they say even evolutionary, that kicks in with the brain. Although why that would be an evolutionary response to death, facing death, who knows? It doesn't make sense. What good would comforting the person who's dying, how could that benefit any species from an evolutionary point of view? That doesn't make sense. Regardless of that. Regardless of the arguments to the contrary, or the weakness of the arguments to the contrary, we should not be surprised to find that even when the brain is not active, the soul is still there. The soul still functions. And because the human soul is not the brain is the material part of the body, and the soul enables it to think. Now, I understand there are others on the atheist side who argue, well, now we can trigger centers in the brain and we can mimic religious experiences. So we can find places in the brain that if we stimulate them by electrodes, that they will mimic religious experiences, like out-of-body experiences that people have, and so on and so forth. And the atheist says, well, you see, that proves that all religious experience is basically all brain-based, so it's all material, it's all chemicals, it's all matter. There is no soul. They would go so far, some of them perhaps, to say, as there is no such thing as a religious experience or mystical experience that we cannot somehow mimic. I guess that's the best word I can think of right now, by stimulating that we can't mimic. There's none that we can't mimic by stimulating parts of the brain. Well, again, we Catholics would easily understand this. We'd say, look, of course, God created the soul, and he created the body for the soul. And so, obviously, if the soul has powers, then the brain that God created for it to interface and act within this world must reflect that. There must be parts of the brain that certainly function in union with the soul. And so we'd expect that what the soul can do in terms of thinking and willing and so on, that there would be parts of the brain that would be mechanisms to do exactly that. So if the soul can experience it in this world, we would expect the brain to show a reflection of that, somehow corresponding to the power of the soul. This would only make sense to us. We don't see that as being a choice between the body and the soul, or a choice between the brain and the mind, the brain and the soul. We think of the mind, in a sense, being the soul and the brain working together when the normal human being, body and soul, are united. So again, the arguments both ways, can be limiting and a little bit faulty. We have to insist on the undeniable arguments, and there are undeniable arguments here. And among them are the arguments that St. Thomas Aquinas made. We have to try to understand them. At first, they may seem very superficial, and in a sense, to the modern mind, even nonsensical. But if we think about them and ponder them and try to understand the concept, St. Thomas Aquinas understood the concepts of existence and perfections and so on, we begin to understand the force of the arguments. Again, the untrained mind might not see that at first and might pass over these arguments because the person doesn't really understand the significance of the vocabulary that St. Thomas is using. But if one really ponders what he's saying, it does take on a real force in the mind. That the fact that anything exists, for example, requires the existence of a fundamental being that exists of itself. One has to think about that quite a bit before one really understands the power of that. Personally, I think that the existence of the human mind and what we do quite naturally, that other forms of life, no other forms of life can do. I know we're furiously and almost with a certain frenzy in some circles, evolutionary circles, looking for intelligent life in other parts of the universe. We're desperately trying to find this so we want to find anything, any life, even a cell or anything that might indicate a life to show that it evolved somewhere else in the universe. That's what the looking for other worlds and so on in certain evolutionary scientific circles is really all about. We've got to find a ratification for the theory of evolution by showing that life evolved somewhere else, that it wasn't created by God, but it just happened by accident somewhere else in the universe. So they're constantly striving to find this, to justify and validate their theories. Any life, let alone intelligent life. But we do find here on earth, in fact, a nature, a human nature that has an ability to think beyond time and beyond space. I can look up into the sky at night and I can see the lights that are arriving in my eye from light years, hundreds, thousands of light years away. And I am a member of a human race that has calculated the distance from the Earth to this star, from that star to my eye, and the light that has traveled and what that light must travel to. And I can even splay out the spectrum of that light, and I can read it, and it can tell me a story about where it came from. And I can even be aware of the fact that what I'm seeing there is that star as it was 1,000 years ago, because it took 1,000 years for that light to get to my eye. And here I am, this little puny creature on this little puny planet, and I'm looking out into this universe, and I'm admiring it and wondering it. I'm even figuring it out. I'm calculating it. I'm even aware of the fact, the time factor, the time difference of what I know about the universe around me. And I can even, as it were, calculate and think in terms of what it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. I can even extrapolate into the millions of years ago, as we do in our fantasies. And I can even extrapolate into the future, 1,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 100 million years from now. I can extrapolate in my fantasy and even my calculations about what the universe will be like then. My human mind, my 3 pounds of brain matter that has deciphered what my eye is seeing, that brain has accomplished such remarkable things. It is not bound by time. It is not bound by space. It can reach back in time, reach forward in time. It can reach across the world. It can reach across the solar system. It can reach across the galaxy. And it brings within its grasp, it seeks this, it thirsts for this knowledge and understanding, bringing within its grasps all that it can see. And what it can't see, it is going to devise a means of seeing it. It is going to build instruments, instruments as big as skyscrapers if necessary, to detect the tiniest little particle. A neutrino. We're desperately looking for the neutrino as a means of trying to explain even dark matter, which we postulate, but we have never seen or heard or touched or anything of the kind. We have no indication, but we're trying to explain something and validate a theory. So we built underground buildings in order to try to capture this thing, even one of them. And we monitor that. We monitored it for years. What is this human mind that does this kind of thing? It is a mind that is actually driven. It is driven for understanding. Remember what I mentioned, that reason is the ability to understand things and their causes. We are driven. We are driven by a sense of purpose. And we're driven by a sense to know why. What is the cause? What is the cause? Even a little child driving his mother or father to distraction, saying, why, manifests the human spirit. The child might be just trying to avoid an answer, which would require him to go to bed on time or eat his carrots and peas. But nonetheless, we all have that driving force within us to understand where we came from, to understand why things are the way they are, with the understanding that when we do understand why the things are the way they are, that we actually have power, that we can then make things happen that would never happen otherwise, but for the fact that we now have control and power, and we can direct these things. We have this power, and not only that, we have the sense of purpose. Without purpose, we die. We just shrivel up and die. It is a fact of our existence that we have the power. But I think one of the most compelling things about the human spirit, and it is a spirit, it is a soul, is that it gives us the power to change ourselves. We have the power to repent. We have the power, even that the angels don't have, in this sense, to repent and be sorry for what we've done, because we find out new information. The angels' intellects are so incisive that they can't find out new information. They knew what was happening. They knew the conclusion, and they embraced it anyway. That's the mystery. But you wouldn't change their minds. But we can change our minds. But we can also reflect on our own character. Remember I mentioned we think in terms of justice and mercy and all those good things, truth and so on, and honesty and obedience, and we see all of these things as virtues, fortitude, bravery, and so on. And we can look at ourselves in the context of these virtues and say to ourselves, each one of us, I do not like what I see. I see certain strengths. I see certain weaknesses. I am going to change myself. I can actually make an act of the will to change myself, my own character. This is remarkable when you think about it. This is utterly remarkable in the human beings. The ability we have to choose between good and evil. And even the ability to reform ourselves and form our characters into what we want them to be, what we believe is the right thing to be, let alone the right thing to do in particular cases. The kind of person we are, we have the power to form that. That's tremendous power. So that's the power that God has given us. There's no other power like that anywhere else on the face of the earth that we know of, except in the human mind, the human heart, the human soul. In connection with this question of the existence of God and modern-day atheism, We did receive an email message from a listener who brought up a very good point, I thought. I'm going to read his email here. I won't give his name, but this is what he writes on December 12th, so just recently. Dear Father Jenkins, thank you for making these excellent catechetical videos as well as the others. I enjoy them myself, and I also like to share them with my non-Catholic friends. There is a possible erratum in the latest lesson. By that he means an error. With regard to St. Thomas Aquinas' first and second ways, he does not think it impossible that there could be an infinite temporal regress of movers or efficient causes, except that God has revealed otherwise in sacred Scripture. His arguments, he says, confer St. Thomas's arguments in De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world, where he explicitly contradicts the theologians of his day who argue that it can be proved from reason alone that the world had a beginning. It seems that his concern was to avoid exposing the true faith to ridicule, which had come from certain Neoplatonists who had correctly refuted those arguments. It is my understanding that St. Thomas' first and second ways are to be taken in terms of a logical and not temporal order. In other words, for the first way, that some things are in motion necessarily implies in the present tense that something moves them which is not itself moved. As for the second way, that some things begin to be implies that they are brought into being by a being which itself has no beginning, or else there is no accounting for the fact that anything begins to be at all. However, if you will notice that the possibility of an infinite series of substantial change without beginning or end is not actually excluded by this, so long as each substance in the series itself has a beginning. It seems that the anti-Catholic philosophers were taking advantage of this point to try to discredit the true doctrine of creation. Therefore, St. Thomas forcefully and rightly, I think, argued that the fact that the world had a beginning was de fide. Thanks again for everything you do for God and His Church, and may God bless you. Yours in Christ, a parishioner at St. Pius V Chapel. Now, I thank this gentleman for writing. I imagine many of you are very confused at this point by what he had to say, because he obviously has some deeper philosophical understanding and deeper philosophical study behind his comments here. He's commenting on what I said earlier, I think in the previous video, about St. Thomas' 5 ways, beginning with the ways of the first mover and the efficient cause. And he wants to clarify something, and he's right in this. As a matter of fact, I would point out that when I began talking about the first and second way of St. Thomas, it actually occurred to me that this is going to need some explanation here, so people don't get the wrong idea. But no sooner had the thought occurred to me, but then I also realized, well, this could get very complicated, so I better just lay down a very, very basic understanding and move on. The point he's making is really worth making, though. He's pointing out that the enemies of the faith, philosophers, even pagan philosophers, even Muslim philosophers, might have ridiculed the faith by saying that there is no rational proof that the world itself, this world, did not always exist, that it necessarily had a beginning in time. And St. Thomas Aquinas agrees with that. He says that we know this world had a beginning in time because it has been revealed by God. St. Thomas says our faith does not require that the world we live in had an actual moment of beginning. I guess now they'd say there's no way to rationally prove, there was no rational ground for proving that there was kind of a big bang. St. Thomas is saying this for this reason, and I think everybody will understand this, that if we say the world exists by a creative act of the divine will, then God always had that creative power. From eternity into eternity, as long as God is God, he had the power to will the universe into existence. And thus, the world could have existed as long as God himself has existed. He could have willed the world to exist from eternity into eternity, with his own existence. Because there was never, ever a moment or a time or a second or a parsecond that God did not have the creative power to make it happen. We know by faith that there was a moment then that God made an explicit creative act and brought the world into existence when it did not exist before. But we cannot say that it had to be that way. God could have willed the universe to exist, as I say, as long as he had the power to will it to exist. And that is not only going forward forever, but it's going backward forever. So when we say, and when St. Thomas says, he talks about a first mover and a first efficient cause, he's not saying that necessarily in terms of time, that this must have preceded in time as an effect the coming of the world into existence. He's saying that in terms of priority, there was a foundation that had to be present there for the existence of this being that does not have to exist of itself. And that foundation is necessarily going to be in order of you might say, priority or precedence. I'm trying to find the word that might convey in a normal, non-philosophical way the point that there had to be that foundation there, and that foundation was the divine will. The first mover had to be there before anything could be moved. Anything else could be moved. The first cause had to be there before anything else could be caused. That could have happened theoretically, hypothetically, from forever, so that there was no beginning as such of the world in time. But the fact is, time had a beginning, and time will have an end. Time is of this, what we call temporal world, because it is a world of time, because it is a world of change. We refer to the temporal world from the Latin word tempus temporis, meaning time. The ancient philosophers defined time as a measure of change according to before and after. And so it is. We live in the temporal world, which had a beginning and has an end. Need it have a beginning and an end? No, insofar as it depends upon the creative will of God. He could have created it without a beginning and without an end. He could have willed it always to be, but he didn't. And that we know by faith. So I thank our writer here, and I appreciate that. I hope you'll keep an eye on things and see in the future if anything needs to be clarified. I would much appreciate his input, and the input from anyone else who has a good constructive point to make. So we're going to resume the video and wrap up now, actually, this third video treatment on the matter of the existence of God and modern atheism, and then move on to lesson number 4. But first, we have some final comments to make. So, in any way, with this, I'm going to leave this question. As I say, it was not a scholarly treatment, and I mentioned it's very colloquial, offhanded. I did make a certain notes to jog my memory here. And sometimes I might not even be in the best condition. But I'm still going to try plodding forward. I appreciate your patience. And any suggestions you might have, I appreciate those too. Please be sure and let us know. Any recommendations you might have. May God bless you.